everyone, welcome. And for those of you still making your way in, welcome too. My name is Al Huang. I'm with the Institute for Policy Integrity at the NYU School of Law. And with me is Michelle Florentine, also with Institute for Policy Integrity. We are presenting today's training as part of the We Act Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center, EPA Region 2. And today our training is going to be on Justice40 and the Climate Economic Justice Screening Tool. So we have a little housekeeping before we get going. Next slide, please. So this meeting is being recorded for the TCTAC, and so it will be available to anyone who wants to access it in the future. And the slides will be part of that too. So there's hyperlinks and things that you want to get from the presentation. You can go and access that later. Remember to keep yourself muted while we're speaking. And if you have a question prior to the Q&A, please put it in the chat. We'll be monitoring it and doing a Q&A session towards the end of the training. And you can raise your hand or, like I said, put it in the chat. And we do not get to your questions during the session. We'll be sure to follow up with you afterwards. Next slide, please. So you saw the logos in the beginning. Our TCTAC, which is led by WEAC, is made up of 8 different organizations in partnership. And we're all part of the EPA Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center, TCTAC, like the little candies, that was created in partnership with the EPA and DOE, Department of Energy. There were 16 centers that were selected to provide technical assistance, capacity building support for communities and their partners to access grant opportunities and engage in decision-making that impacts them. And this training is part of the services that we're offering for Region 2 WEAC TCTAC, which serves New York, New Jersey. If you want more information about other TCTACs in the area and nationally, you can go to the link right there. And finally, this particular TCTAC, our overall goal is to build power and knowledge in EJ communities, create and strengthen EJ networks within our region, and help groups gain access to grant and funding opportunities so they're better positioned to advance and address environmental and energy justice issues. So this is the training. Welcome. So a big part of, as I said before, with this TCTAC is helping communities and others access funding. And a large program right now that our federal government has is called Justice40, which is providing billions of dollars to disadvantaged in the environmental justice communities throughout the country. We're going to talk about that program today and the screening tool that is part of it to identify whether you're a disadvantaged community. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with a poll. And for everyone, this is going to pop up on your screen. And if you could just answer it briefly, that'd be great. Are you familiar with how the federal government defines whether a community is a disadvantaged community for the purposes of receiving Justice40 funds? So I'll give everyone a couple seconds to answer that. We're getting some results in right now. Ready? Okay. You want to publish that poll so everyone can see it? So as you can see, not surprisingly, not many of you are familiar, and some are somewhat familiar, and some don't know at all. So hopefully this training will help answer a lot of your questions for those who don't know much, and for those who know more, maybe you'll learn something today. Next slide, please. We're going to have 2 parts in our training today. I'm leading the first one, which is what is Justice40. We're going to kind of establish a background on what Justice40 is, identify types of projects that Justice40 may provide funding for, talk about how its progress is being tracked, and also where to find Justice40 funding opportunities. And then part 2, Michelle will cover the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, CEJST for short, and talk about how do you qualify for these funds as a disadvantaged community. And there'll be a live tutorial on how to use the Justice40 CEJST tool online. Next slide, please. So for Justice40, I'm going to be covering what is Justice40, where did the idea come from, what kind of federal investments does Justice40 apply to, examples of covered programs and benefits under Justice 40, and how Justice 40 activities are being tracked and where you can find out about funding opportunities. So what is Justice 40? It starts with President Biden's executive order 14,008, Tackling Climate Change at Home and Abroad, which he issued in January 2021. And it created a government-wide Justice 40, we say J40 initiative, establishing the goal that at least 40% of benefits of quote unquote certain federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities, or otherwise known as DACs, DACs. The order says that the aim for creating this was to address decades of systemic, inequitable historical policies and underinvestment in disadvantaged communities, as well as to bring resources to communities most impacted by climate change, pollution, and environmental hazards. In the executive order, it says the investments should be in the areas of clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable, sustainable housing, training and workforce development, the remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, and development of critical clean water infrastructure. We're going to talk more about what kind of areas kind of fit into that. Next slide, please. So where did the idea come from? It's useful to kind of talk about where it came from so we can get kind of at least reflect on where the origins of this idea comes from, and also how are they doing. So the first place that we know of a kind of Justice 40 type goal is in the California Global Warming Solution Act of 2006, known as AB 32. It was one of the first state legislation that was passed to address climate change and establish climate protection goals and requirements, as well as a system for reducing carbon dioxide. In that law, funds generated from the sale of credits, it had a trading program, created what's called the California Climate Investments, were to come back to the state and then deposit into a greenhouse gas reduction fund. And in 2016, the California legislature passed a bill that required Cal EPA to set minimum funding levels for disadvantaged communities. So of those funds, they set percentages of where that money has to be invested. And they were, first one, at least 25% funds must be allocated to disadvantaged communities. That was one. At least 5% had to be allocated towards projects with low-income communities or low-income households. And at least 5% had to be allocated towards projects within and benefiting low-income communities, low-income households that are outside of a Cal EPA-defined dock, but within a half mile of a disadvantaged community. So like if you add that all up, it's 35%. And we have some data to show how it went. In 2020, the funds generated in total from the trading program was 3.1 billion, of which 1.25 billion, which is approximately 40%, they kind of exceeded their goal, went to DOCs 773 and low-income households 519. The other example we have is a recent one, and this one actually is a lot more like Justice 40. As you can see above, AB 32, a lot of those funds really were funds generated from trading. And the New York Climate Leadership Community Protection Act of 2019, the CLCPA, set goals to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, transition to carbon-free electric, and reach economy-wide net zero carbon emissions. And in that law, they set other goals too about investments in docks that are much more similar to Justice 40. The first one was that, the goal was that disadvantaged communities will receive, quote, 40% of overall benefits of spending on clean energy and energy efficiency programs, and requires that such communities receive at least 35% of the overall benefits of spending on clean energy, energy efficiency projects, programs, and investments as determined by the state. We're currently, the state of New York is currently in the process of developing the guidance, and so this program has not been implemented yet, so we don't have any data. But as you can see, it's much more similar to Justice 40 in that we're talking about overall spending, not just revenue generated. Next slide, please. So what kind of investments does Justice 40 apply to? So these would be the things that could be counted as part of reaching that goal. So let's do the first bullet, please. The White House did issue a Justice 40 guidance on July 2021 and an updated one on January 2023. The links are there if you want to go take a closer look at them. And each federal agency was expected to submit a Justice 40 plan and strategy that identified a stakeholder engagement plan, as well as specific programs and funds that would apply towards the Justice 40 goal. And just to note there, it's not clear whether all agencies have actually met this requirement. Next bullet. Each federal agency also was expected to submit additional information on how they would define a doc and how they would maximize, calculate, and track benefits to docs. There is a list that was published in November 2023 where you can see what agencies have claimed are initiatives covered by Justice 40, or they're claiming these are Justice 40 programs, and there's a link to that you can take a look at. And finally, in addition to how agencies decide to disperse funds that are covered under Justice 40, there's also been federal laws legislation signed into law by the president that directs additional funds to docs that will meet the Justice 40 goals. And just for example, there are billions of dollars of different types of benefits in the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill that provide funding for Justice 40 initiative programs too. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kind of briefly talk about different types of examples of covered programs and what kind of benefits might be considered Justice 40 benefit. And you can click the next bullet here. So, and this is in the White House guidance. So under the category of climate change, I'm going to kind of run through a couple of these just so you can get an idea. You'll see a whole bullet list of different types of benefits. Now, why this is important is if you're a community out there and you're working on any of these issues, these are all different issues that are covered under Justice 40 for grants and whatnot. And so if you're working on one of these issues, it's very likely there may be grants available by federal agencies to help you do that work. And under climate change, there are things such as reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and local air pollutants, looking at technical assistance, community engagement, flood mitigation benefits, and urban heat-on work as well. Next slide, please. In these next three categories, clean energy, energy efficiency, clean transportation, and affordable sustainable housing, here's some more bullets of types of benefits that would be considered a Justice 40 benefit. So here we see reduction of energy burdens under clean energy efficiency programs, resources. Under clean transportation, we see things like access to affordable clean electric vehicles, charging stations, and purchase programs, reduction of harmful exposure to harmful transportation-related emissions. And under affordable sustainable housing, we see things like addressing indoor air quality, issues around displacement, and improving housing quality and reducing housing cost burdens as different examples. Next slide, please. And then finally, under these last three categories, training, workforce development, remediation, reduction of legacy pollution, and development of critical clean water infrastructure, we see things such as funding for perhaps like job training programs with energy communities. We see things such as like criteria, air pollutant, toxic air pollutant exposure, farm worker exposure to pesticides, brownfield and Superfund remediation, community engagement, and under clean water, we see things such as replacement of lead service lines and reduction in the quantity of raw sewage discharge as examples of programs that would be covered. Next slide, please. So how are these activities being tracked, and where do you find Justice 40 opportunities? So the executive order also directed the White House Council on Environmental Quality to create an EJ scorecard. There's a link you can do to see it. One of the goals of the scorecard was to measure the administration's progress on implementing the Justice 40 initiative, among other EJ efforts. The scorecard's currently in phase one. They just closed comments, or I think they extended it actually. They did extend it rather, for phase one. And for each agency, there's a page, and it describes all these different metrics. And one of them under Justice 40 includes some things such as how many covered programs they have and how much money they distributed. It kind of depends on which agency. Some agencies don't report much. EPA, for example, does report a lot. And they also give some highlights of what programs were covered under that. So how do you find out about funding opportunities under Justice 40? And so like we said before, I said that there's the EJ scorecard. Also earlier, I mentioned the White House had published that report in November showing all the covered programs by agency that they know of. But how do you find out where the grants are? That's really what this is about, right? Communities applying for grants. So first bullet, please. Unfortunately, there's no federal government site currently that lists all the J40 funding opportunities that are available. There are some alternatives to that. So the first one is this TCTAC, and at the end of this presentation, there'll be a QR code if you're not already signed up for our newsletter. But in our monthly newsletter, we do provide a selection of funding opportunities with our deadlines that are available, that many of them are mostly Justice 40 related funding for disadvantaged communities. Third bullet, please. The Environmental Protection Network, who is a national partner for the TCTACs, including ours, also posts bi-weekly-ish updates and funding opportunities, and there's a link here where you can find out about them. Next bullet. And finally, a third party has created the Justice 40 Accelerator, which provides a list of funding opportunities. This one's actually pretty good. So you can see what agencies are currently putting out there as funding opportunities and grant opportunities, and then which are all under Justice 40. So you can find out what might apply to you. And then finally, there is, of course, grants.gov, which is the federal government's all things grants. I will say it's kind of hard to navigate that site, unfortunately, which is why we recommend some of the resources above. So that's kind of the Justice 40 rundown. I'm now going to pass over to Michelle Florentine, who's going to talk more about like how do you use the CEJST tool to qualify as a disadvantaged community, which would allow you to pursue some of these funds. So I'm going to hand it over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Al. So for this portion of the presentation, I am going to be reviewing the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, which is commonly referred to as CEJST. And by the end of this presentation, I hope you'll all walk away with a good understanding of what CEJST is, what CEJST is meant to do, how you can use CEJST in your funding applications, and what are the limitations of CEJST. Next slide, please. So what is CEJST and why was it created? As Al previously mentioned, Executive Order 14008 directed CEQ to create a geospatial screening tool that identifies disadvantaged communities. And CEQ, which is also the Council on Environmental Quality, created CEJST to address them. Next slide. So what is CEJST meant to do? Federal agencies should use CEJST to identify disadvantaged communities who should benefit from Justice 40 programs. And this directive or this instruction is included in two main documents: the Office of Management and Budget's addendum to the Justice 40 interim guidance and the Council for Environmental Quality's CEJST instructions to federal agencies. So if you want more information on these tools or some background Justice 40 and the CEJST tool, you should refer to these documents that are linked here. And on the slide, you'll also see the list of Justice 40 program categories that Al reviewed just a few moments ago. And so CEJST is created to allow you to review the different types of socioeconomic, environmental, and climate variables that answer a lot of the environmental justice issues in these categories. Next slide. So you all are probably wondering, what is a disadvantaged community? The polls seem to indicate that a lot of folks are unfamiliar with the tool or have limited knowledge. So I want to break down the definition of disadvantaged community into two parts. The first is what qualifies as a community, and the second is what does disadvantage even mean? So the Justice 40 interim guidance states that agencies should define a community as either a group of individuals living in geographic proximity to one another or a geographically dispersed set of individuals, such as migrant workers or Native Americans, where either type of group experiences common conditions. Now, CEJST only applies to identifying disadvantaged communities that are geographically defined, not those that are geographically dispersed. So that's an important thing to know. In terms of what disadvantage means, to determine whether a community is, quote, disadvantaged, agencies consider appropriate data, indices, and screening tools based on a combination of different variables that may include, but are not limited to, low income, high and/or persistent poverty, high housing costs and substandard living, high transportation cost burdens, energy cost burdens. The list goes on and on. Next slide. So how do you interpret CEJST? In order to interpret CEJST, there are a few key definitions that I want you to walk away understanding. The first is census tract. So when you're on CEJST, you'll notice that data is presented to you by census tract, which are small geographic units that typically have a population of 12 to 1,800 people. CEJST actually uses the data from the 2010 census, not the 2020 census. So this may present a limitation to you when using CEJST if, say, the census tracts in your community have been redefined between 2010 and 2020. So please just keep that in mind. We aren't aware of a notice from CEJST that says when they plan to incorporate the 2020 census data, but we anticipate that as new versions of CEJST are released, they will include this information. Second, disadvantaged communities, we've just gone over that definition, but when you're on CEJST, you'll notice that disadvantaged communities are located in census tracts that experience burdens and are highlighted in blue. CEJST actually ranks most burdens by percentiles. Now, what does percentile mean? A common misunderstanding of percentile is that, let's say, you're looking at a census tract and it says it's in the 96th percentile for asthma rates. That does not mean that 96% of people in that census tract experience asthma. Instead, that means this percentile shows how a tract's burden compares to other census tracts. So if a census tract says it's in the 96th percentile for asthma, that means that compared to all census tracts, it's in the 96th percentile, and or another way to phrase it is that it's in the top 4% of high asthma rates when compared to other tracts. Thresholds are the cutoffs used to determine if a tract is disadvantaged. And some burdens use percentiles or percentages, while others use a simple yes or no. And when I'm in the tutorial portion of the presentation, I'll show you an example of that. Next slide. So how are communities identified as disadvantaged? Communities are considered disadvantaged if they meet one of two requirements usually. The first is they are in census tracts that meet the thresholds for at least one of the tools burden categories. And the other option is that they are on land within the boundaries of federally recognized tribes. It's important to note that for all burden categories except workforce development, census tracts must be at or above the 65th percentile for low income. The exception to this is that if a census tract that is completely surrounded by disadvantaged communities and is at or above the 50th percentile for low income, then it is identified as a disadvantaged community. Next slide. So what are the burden categories that CEJST is using? There are 8 burden categories in total. The first 4 are displayed on the screen right here. And you'll see that each of these burden categories has their own unique definition and threshold requirements for a census tract to satisfy that burden. So I'm just going to select the energy burden as an example to walk through. So here, communities that are identified as disadvantaged under the energy burden need to be at or above the 90th percentile for energy cost or particulate matter 2.5, and they have to be at or above the 65th percentile for low income. Next slide, please. And these are the other four types of burden categories that CEJST uses: legacy pollution, transportation, water and wastewater, and workforce development. I want to pause and actually look at the workforce development one as an example. Um, Workforce development says that communities are identified as disadvantaged if the track is at or above the 90th percentile for linguistic isolation, or low median income, poverty, or unemployment, and more than 10% of people ages 25 and older um, have less than a high school diploma. So you'll see that this requirement is taking the place of the 65th percentile for low income requirement or threshold that we see in the other burden categories. Next slide. So before we walk into the tutorial, I just want to pause and note a few limitations to CEJST and the data that it relies on. So first, CEJST does not consider race and ethnicity data when determining if a census tract satisfies at least one burden category. This has caused a bit of contention between the federal government and environmental justice communities because, as we all are likely aware, there are several research studies that show that race and ethnicity are key predictors of whether a community experiences disproportionate rates of pollution and other environmental justice injustices. So many EJ experts and advocates believe that the federal government excluded race and ethnicity to avoid various court challenges, especially in light of recent Supreme Court decisions concerning affirmative action and racial classifications. And so to avoid similar issues and challenges to the Justice40 initiative and conferring benefits to communities based off of race, we believe that this is why the federal government has excluded this information from this determination. But you can review race and ethnicity data from the census when you select specific census tracts in the tool. Another set of limitations that I want to highlight is actually relevant for those of you who are in US territories. So Puerto Rico and US Virgin Islands are a part of the Region 2 TCTAC, and there are differences in the available data for these territories. For Puerto Rico, all relevant and available fields in the energy, housing, legacy pollution, transportation, and workforce development are available, but some information will be missing for other burden categories, or that information for those burden categories might not be provided at all. And then for those of you who might have been following the beta version of CEJST, which was the unofficial version of CEJST, linguistic isolation was previously included in the beta version, but is not included in CEJST 1.0, which is the current version of CEJST. In terms of US Virgin Islands, there's information available for unemployment, poverty, low median income, and high school education. And all of this information is included in the workforce development category. And all of this information can be found, all this information concerning territories can be found in the methodology and data tab on the CEJST website, which I'll show you momentarily. Next slide. And so what data is included in CEJST? The data comes from various different sources to identify climate, environmental, and other burdens on communities. So there are multiple data sets, including but not limited to low income and poverty rates, projected flood risk, rates of asthma, diabetes, and heart disease, historic underinvestment, lack of green space, etc. And CEJST provides information on these data sets on the CEJST website under the methodology and data tab. Next slide. So what data is actually included in these data sets? On the slide, there's just two examples of these data sets. And if you'll see that each data set has its own definition, information about which burden category it's used in, and who the source of this data, as well as for information on which states and US territories this information is available for. So if you look to the ASNA data set, you'll see that it's defined as the share of people who have answered yes to both of these questions. Have you ever been told by a health professional that you have asthma, and do you still have asthma? And this data is used in the health burden category, and there's information there on the source of this data and that it's available in all US states and the District of Columbia. Next slide. And so for this next portion of the presentation, I'm actually going to hop off of these slides and go to the CEJST website to show you how you can use the tool. Okay, so I think everyone should be able to see the screen now. So this is the main mapping page of CEJST. If you scroll to the right-hand side, you'll see a lot of the definitions that I just went over a few minutes ago, based off of census tracts, thresholds, defining percentiles, that information. And so the first step in using the tool is plugging in an address or the city or zip code of your community. So since we're here in New York, I'm actually going to plug in a nearby neighborhood, Castle Hill, which is in the Bronx. So it might take a moment to load. And so here is Castle Hill in the Bronx. And the first thing you'll see is that some tracks are highlighted in this faint color blue and others are not. And this is obviously a bit of a limitation to CEJST, because this portion that is not highlighted is definitely a part of this community. It's just, it didn't satisfy certain burdens necessary to make it qualify as a disadvantaged community. So in order to walk through the tool, I'm going to select a census tract and show you the first thing that you see. The first thing you see is that this census tract is identified as a disadvantaged community because more than one burden threshold was satisfied. You can also see race and ethnicity data here in this dropdown. And so you can tell that this is a predominantly Black and Brown community, with 52% of folks identifying as Black and 46% identifying as Hispanic or Latino. You can also see age information from the census here as well. So you can see the percent of folks who are over the age of 65, children under the age of 10, and then everyone in between those age ranges. And this might be helpful information to leverage in a funding application if, say, your community has a lot of elderly folks and children who may be more vulnerable or susceptible to respiratory illnesses due to elevated air pollution. Now, when you scroll down, you'll see all of the 8 burden categories listed. And if a tract satisfied the burden for this category, then it will be highlighted in this shade of blue. So I'm going to take you through just 1 or 2 of these burden categories, but you'll notice that this particular census tract met the burden for at least 6 of the 8 categories. So dropping down to the health burden, you'll see that this tract is in the 96th percentile for asthma. So, and then you'll also see a definition or an abbreviated definition of what this variable means and how it's defined. So this is just saying the share of people who have been told that they have asthma. You'll also see right here underneath their percentile, the threshold for this particular variable. So although this track only needed to be above the 90th percentile, they're at the 96th. So very, very high. You'll also see that they satisfied the low income burden to satisfy this health burden. If you scroll down to, say, the legacy pollution burden category, you'll see an example of a variable that uses a yes or no check mark instead of reporting a percentage or percentile. So this variable is seeking to answer the presence of one or more abandoned mine lands within the tract. So this particular one does not have any abandoned mine lands within this boundary. Something else I want to point out here is this definition of proximity to hazardous waste facilities. So you'll see the definition of this is the count of hazardous waste facilities within 5 kilometers. And this particular census tract is in the 94th percentile. The threshold was to be above the 90th. Now, here is the note about the US territories and the available information that I had mentioned previously. And across the page, you'll see different types of hyperlinks to share data sources with CEQ and to help them improve the tool. So if you have any questions, feedback, or suggested sources that they should include in their data sets, you can reach out to CEQ using one of these 2 links right here. And you can also download and export data from the tool itself by going to the downloads page. Now I'm going to hop onto the methodology and data page to show you where you can refresh your memory about some of the information we shared with you today. So here, all the categories of burdens are listed with their definitions and their thresholds. And when you keep scrolling down, you'll see the data sets that were used in version 1.0 of the CEJST tool. And so you'll be able to reference this information when you're using the tool, because I know it's a lot to remember. And so now I'm gonna actually hop back onto the slides to finish our presentation. Next slide, please. So you're probably wondering by now, how can I use CEJST to leverage the strength of my funding application? So the first thing we recommend is to reference CEJST data to describe the environmental and socioeconomic conditions affecting your community, to really tell a story about all of the obstacles and environmental justice issues that your community faces. So every time you have a burden category, you should review all of the variables under that burden category. You should also mention all of the burdens your community faces. So let's say you were like a census tract, like the one I just showed you in Castle Hill, that had not just 1, but 6 burden categories satisfied. You could say something like, based on the CEJST tool, our community has multiple environmental and socioeconomic burdens, including, and then you list them out and expand on information that you think really tells the story of your community. You can also cite research studies to explain how the burdens that CEJST has identified in your community impact the health and livelihoods of your community members. So like the example, taking the example of the Castle Hill tract, let's say there's a tract that has a very large population of children, elderly folks, and people with certain pre-existing conditions like asthma or diabetes. You can cite research studies that show that these populations are especially susceptible to health issues related to elevated levels of particulate matter or other poor air quality indicators. So you could say something like more than X% of our community's population is either under the age of 10 or over the age of 65. And our community also has incredibly high rates of asthma, which further places our more vulnerable community members at risk of hospitalization for severe asthma attacks during peak traffic hours, hot summer days, and operating hours of nearby fossil fuel fired plants. So this is just an example, a very brief example of leveraging CEJST data and also leveraging other information that's already out there that's maybe general about the public health risks of the burdens your community faces, or maybe there's information specifically about your community that has been published or released. Like some communities have several news reports concerning high hospitalizations due to severe asthma attacks. So maybe that's also something you can include alongside CEJST data. And the last thing we want to recommend is include screenshots, include data that you've exported to CEJST in your application to really remind funders or remind folks reviewing your applications about the gravity of the burdens your community faces. Next slide. So before we wrap up our presentation, we wanted to share some links to important documents that you might want to reference in the next coming months when you're looking at funding applications, or you just want to learn more about how to use CEJST and learn more about the Justice40 initiative. So there's a link directly to CEJST. You can also Google CEJST and it'll come up right away, as well as EQ's instructions to federal agencies on using CEJST, and the CEJST methodology and the addendum to the Justice40 interim guidance that I previously mentioned. I also want to briefly talk about how certain agencies have specific resources, like EPA has EJ Screen, FEMA has a resilience analysis and planning tool, and the Department of Energy is in a beta mode for an environmental justice mapping tool. So these are also tools separate from CEJST that you might want to cross-reference to see what information they have about your community. So I'll just end it there and start the Q&A portion. Next slide, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to our training. This is our contact information if you want to reach out to us with any additional questions. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, sorry, question answers. Here we go. So I'm going to moderate this. I see we have a number of questions in the chat, and I've responded to some of them, but there are a number here that are still not responded to. So why don't I go through them? So the first one is, for the percentiles, is it comparing numbers across the country or within that specific state or territory? I think we did address. Michelle, do you want to say something about that?
Yes. So I personally have not found an asterisk on the CEJST website clarifying this, but I assume that it's nationwide, but we can also do further research and get back to you once we have a clear answer on that.
Yeah, that's what my understanding is too. It's based on national. Yeah. Second question here, and I did answer this in the column. I'll just read it. Why is PM 2.5 in the energy category and not in the health category, since it's a health and wellness related issue? There's a lot of things like this. I think folks want to see every single thing in there. And I think there's some other questions regarding radon gas and safe drinking water violations, why everything's not. I'm part of that, and there is kind of a discussion in the methodology, and there's been other reviews of the CEJST tool. But part of it has to do with data availability and the ability to have data consistent across the country, where you can compare and contrast. So they definitely selected some that there are better data sets, and I'm guessing radon might be one of those. But for this particular question, the reason why is like the energy category, the health category doesn't have particular pollutants in it. It has health conditions it's tracking. And so the pollutant, it's tracking the health outcome, not the pollutant exposure. And then if you look at the actual different burden sections like energy, then it's covering, well, PM 2.5, because that's a pollutant associated with energy generation. I don't know, Michelle, if you have anything to add to that, but I think that's
Yeah.
be short.
I think I think the only thing I'll add is that I think in terms of how CEQ might be trying to define environmental justice, it's looking at communities who are experiencing the harms of energy facilities, and then also not only are not getting the benefits from these energy facilities, but are being burdened by high cost of energy and are not being included in discussions of having more equity in the energy transition. So I think that might also be a part of why they're using PM 2.5 as part of the definition of like which type of census tract will qualify as a disadvantaged community related to energy burdens.
Another question we have is, if the tool excludes a nearby community, does that mean it does not qualify? How about coast areas that are not where people live, but where they recreate? It says recreate. I think they meant recreate. I think this was partially covered by the point you made, Michelle, about the other, if you're surrounded by disadvantaged communities, but do you want to respond to that one?
Yes. So in terms of areas that might not be highly populated, this is not something that's necessarily been highlighted in suggest information, but I do think that if a coastal area that's not very well populated and isn't necessarily from the small population that lives there and reported on the census, are not displaying some of these environmental or socioeconomic burdens, the tract likely might not qualify as a disadvantaged community. But let's say that nearby tracts qualify as a disadvantaged community. Perhaps there could be work there to, in funding applications, elevate surrounding area or emphasize surrounding areas that qualify as disadvantaged community, and just acknowledge that maybe part of what you define as your community is not captured as disadvantage in your funding application. But I think what Al's referencing is this, what appears to be an automatic function in CEJST, where if you're not meeting a certain threshold for low income, but do you experience some burdens and are surrounded by census tracts that have already been identified as disadvantaged communities, then that tract might be identified as a disadvantaged community if they satisfy a slightly lower threshold for low income. I hope I answered that, but if I did not, please reach out to us.
Next, what do you suggest to communities whose census tract is not highlighted as disadvantaged and suggest, but who are clearly environmental justice communities? I mean, I think this is a great question, and this gets to kind of the point we raised earlier about some of the limitations of suggest. I mean, race not being one of those factors, but I think what it is worth saying though is that like most communities don't exist within one census tract, right? So it might be a combination of a number. And I think the key here is that when you're applying for a grant, and let's say you're an EJ community and none of the communities in a census tract that's been identified as disadvantaged, or in the alternative, there's a mix mash of disadvantaged, not disadvantaged. I think there's no bright line. I mean, this CEJST was created as a guidance tool. And there is discretion from each agency, and also depending on what each individual agency is using as their additional doc definition, or whether they're like some of them, like DOE, prioritizes other factors of how they want to identify a disadvantaged community, right? That are relevant to the expert or the issue areas of that agency. But like what I would say is that like part of all these tools is to tell your story. And Michelle was mentioning it earlier. I mean, there's EJ Screen. Someone asked a question before this workshop about what's the difference between EJ Screen and CEJST. EJ Screen is developed by EPA, does include race, but really is focused more on like rulemaking, permitting, citing, not CEJST, which was created to look at dispersing funding, right? So you might want to use a combination of all these tools. So you might not appear as a disadvantaged community under CEJST, but maybe EJ Screen shows there's different types of cumulative burdens, whatnot. There's pollution sites cited inside your community. I would present all of those, as Michelle mentioned earlier, in your funding application to make that case, or that you're surrounded by others, or that you're close to these burdens X, Y, and Z in some justification. But I don't think that we should be saying, I'm not disadvantaged, I'm not going to apply for it at all. I mean, I think there are usually ways you can tell that story. But again, it is a limitation of CEJST. And I don't know, Michelle, whether there's anything to add to that.
No, I think you did a good job explaining that.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions here. Let me see. For the neighborhood, how do we arrive at a 40% threshold for dock as opposed to a 30 or 50%? Good question. I have a guess, but Michelle, do you want to take a crack on that?
Could you actually rephrase the question? Because I actually might not.
Oh, it says how did when they say we, I think I meant like CEQ. How did they arrive at a 40% threshold for dock as opposed to a 30 or 50? I mean, I'm not sure exactly which burden category they're talking about, but I'm getting that the general question is how were the thresholds decided, the percentages decided?
I'm not sure how the thresholds have been determined. There's probably a lot of back and forth during the beta process as to setting those standards. And I know with low income in particular, I think there was a lot of conversation about what the percentile threshold should be. In terms of 30 or 40%, I'm not recalling a particular variable or burden category that uses that particular number. So I wonder if this question was actually meant to refer to Justice40.
Yeah, if you have whoever asks that, if you have a more specific ask on that, please send that and we'll do our best to get back to you on that. Okay, there's another question. I am working on a grant that says to use CEJST to determine high poverty areas. Would high poverty just be considered above the threshold for any of the categories? You want to take a shot at that, Michelle?
I can't purport for this to know about this particular funding application, but I would assume yes. Like if it's going to qualify as a low income community, it has to meet at least that 65th percentile threshold that most of the burden categories require, with the exception of the workforce development burden category. That threshold will look different though if, say, you go on Suggest and you see that your community is surrounded by other census tracts that already satisfy the burdens to be a disadvantaged community, and the tract that you're specifically looking at has a lower rate of low income but is still above the revised percentile threshold of 50% for that type of community that otherwise wouldn't have qualified as disadvantaged, then the story or the determination might look different.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's my understanding as well. Okay, we still have time for some more questions here. So I have one. If your community is disadvantaged in one category, for example, transportation, but you want to fund water infrastructure, would that community still be considered disadvantaged in this context? i.e. you are interested in working on a project in a category that is not burdened, even if the community as a whole categorized disadvantage? It's a good question. I mean, from what I understand, the way, as soon as you're designated disadvantage in any of the burden categories, you can qualify as disadvantaged for any of the funds that are eligible for disadvantaged communities to apply for under Justice 40. It doesn't have to be a straight line match. That being said, though, I mean, if you're applying for like a water infrastructure like grant and there is a burden there, I would think, because they still have to make decisions about, I mean, they can't give, everyone who applies might not get the money or very possibly will not get the money. But I mean, I think you could say, hey, we specifically have a burden here. That would seem to maximize your chances of winning that grant. But from what I understand, as long as you're a disadvantaged community in any of the burdens, you are a disadvantaged community for the purposes of Justice 40.
I
I
would
don't know,
also
Michelle.
like to, yeah, I would also like to add to that. If there's any way for you to show a connection between the burden categories that are above the threshold and like the issue that you're trying to receive funding for, that's something that you can address in your funding application. So just trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but you said in the case of like transportation, you might qualify or satisfy the burden for transportation, but not for water or wastewater infrastructure. Then maybe there might be, I don't know, like things from the highway. Like I know there's cases where like diesel or spills from highways kind of leak into communities somehow, or um, maybe you could also just alternatively look at um, what the percentiles of water issues in your community were when you're on Suggest, even if your community did not exceed the threshold for a certain variable, it still shows you what percentile you're in. So if you're in the, um, let's say wastewater discharge is one variable under water and wastewater, um, and the threshold for that is you have to be above the 90th percentile. And let's say you just missed the cutoff and you're at the 88th. Like, say that. Say we're basically still inundated with these wastewater discharge issues, even though we technically did not satisfy the burden requirement.
And again, I mean, the disadvantaged designation indicates the community as a whole is overburdened. And specifically in those areas, but as Michelle is saying, if it doesn't hit that threshold, I mean, we all know, and you can make the case too, that, you know, a lot of these burdens are interconnected with each other and exacerbated by each other as well. So, I mean, I don't think it would exclude you from getting that grant. But of course, it would be much more in point if you could point to this, we're a burden in that category that we're applying for. But we have another question here. Under transportation, diesel particulate matter is a determination for a disadvantaged community. Yeah, that's right. That is another place where oh, sorry, this is not a question. This is just a comment. That is true. It does appear under transportation and energy, PM 2.5. I think we have time for one more question here. Let me see here. I may have missed it, but is there an easy way to look at neighborhoods around commercial airports other than looking up airports like JFK, LGA specifically? I mean, what you could do is you can look up JFK or LaGuardia, and then it will show you the whole map, and you can zoom back and look at the communities around it and see what colors they are. If there's a blue grayish color, it's disadvantaged. So that you can do it that way. You don't have to. It's like any Google map; it will show you everything. It's not just going to show you the one thing you looked up. So you can don't forget you can always zoom back and then zoom in, and then click on any of the census tracts surrounding a point of interest that you're looking at. Anything else to add to that, Michelle? I think that's all right. Well, thank you, everyone. We didn't get to everybody's question, but for those we didn't get to, we'll be sure to follow up with you. If you have more questions, please reach out to us. And now you'll see up on your screen, you can email the EJ TCTAC, the WEAC EJ TCTAC directly. You can visit us at our site, or scan this QR code and join our mailing list. And I did see a comment question here. Yes, these slides will be made available on the site, I believe, our TCTAC site, as well as there'll probably be a hyperlink in the upcoming newsletter that summarizes the things that have happened. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you to WEAC, our partners and the leader of our TCTAC, all other members, and to all the folks in the region that are interested in these issues. We look forward to working with you. Thank you.